Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The United Nations has accused the government of being in a state of denial about the extent of poverty in the UK. A UN envoy visited 9 towns and cities over 12 days and concluded that levels of poverty are a disgrace. More details from our social affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan.
I am watching poverty cripple my mother.
I lost my house and it's a lonely world out there.
Go to school, go to college and spend all your money on university. It doesn't work like that anymore.
Often ignored, but for the past 10 days, the poor have been listened to.
Why are so many people crumbling under their burden and losing their fight?
Here in Jaywick in Essex, England's poorest area, the United Nations came to hear what it's like to have little.
If I was to die now, no one would miss me, I'm useless, I can't provide for my family, I'm just going to end it.
The meeting was one of 9 held across the UK by the UN Special Investigator on Extreme Poverty. His conclusion, the government is in denial about the problem.
What I saw is a lot of misery. A lot of people who feel that the system is failing them. A lot of people who feel that the system is really there just to punish them.
Philip Alston said he found staggering levels of child poverty and a harsh welfare regime that tells the poor
that people who need benefits should be reminded constantly that they are lucky to get anything, that nothing will be made easy.
He called for immediate changes to universal credit, the main welfare reform, and deplored the disproportionate effect on women of benefit changes.
If you had got a group of misogynists in a room and said, guys, how can we make this system work for men and not for women, they wouldn't have come up with too many other ideas than what's already in place.
As you'd expect, ministers have hit back, saying they completely disagree with the UN's analysis. They say that household incomes have never been higher. There are 1 million fewer people living in absolute poverty than in 2010, and that they're committed to providing the right support to those in need. The UN's criticisms won't quickly improve the lot of the poor in Jaywick or elsewhere, but they may focus more minds on the daily struggles of millions of Britons. Michael Buchanan, BBC News.
Punitive, mean-spirited and callous. That's how the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Poverty describes the government's austerity policies. And he says the rise in child poverty is a social calamity and economic disaster. In a few minutes, I'll put those criticisms to Mel Stride, the Treasury Minister. But before that, Jackie Long, our Social Affairs Editor, who has been speaking to Professor Alston, is with me. Jackie.
It is difficult to overstate how damning this report is. Philip Alston says today that the government could do very much more to eliminate poverty. It simply chooses not to. Now, well aware of his own critics who say he should focus his gaze elsewhere in the world where things are very much worse. He says this: the UK is the 5th richest economy in the world, and yet millions are living in poverty. 1.5 million are destitute. He says the government is in a state of denial about what is happening to some of the poorest in society. Now, the Department for Work and Pensions told us today they disagree with everything Philip Alston has said. We went to hear exactly what he did have to say.
The state does not have your back any longer. You are on your own.
The damning assessment of Britain's treatment of its poorest from UN Rapporteur Philip Alston. We followed him over the last fortnight as he travelled across the country, meeting people in food banks and advice centres. Today he said the government turned a tin ear to the hardship many were facing.
I'm a mother, I should be able to look after my family properly, not have to beg in these places for food.
Facing criticism that the UN should focus on places across the world where people were much worse off, he said this.
I don't think it's a very useful comparator to say, my good man, you're about to get 20 lashes, but I can assure you that in other countries they'll give you 50. Every country has to be measured against what it's capable of doing. And Britain is certainly capable of eliminating most, if not all, of its poverty if it wanted to.
The Department for Work and Pensions said today they completely disagreed with his analysis and that household incomes had never been higher. There are many people who argue there is no real poverty in the UK, and really you shouldn't be here.
They should have been with me over the last couple of weeks. There are, the figures, the think tanks are not doing this in order to keep themselves in employment. People are not on the streets, people are not going to food banks. Thousands of food banks haven't sprung up because people are looking for things to do. There's very real poverty out there.
You met with government. What was their response?
They were pretty much unconcerned. They think that their policies are working. They focus really only on employment. And it is a way out of poverty. There's no doubt about that. But the point is that the 1.5 million people who are in destitution are not being covered by the work hours that they're getting. So there's a lot of in-work poverty.
You've touched on it today that there have already been many reports about problems with universal credit, and yet you're saying the government isn't listening. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's sort of sad because universal credit was a great idea and potentially still is a good idea. It's just the way it's been implemented, where it's involved constant cuts to everything and has involved a number of elements which are really punitive in ways that are quite unnecessary.
You'll be familiar with the criticism that the United Nations would really be better placed going to places like Yemen, where children are dying every day, rather than coming to the UK, and that you actually shouldn't be here looking at this issue.
Well, those two things are separate. I spend most of my days looking at situations in countries around the world, many of them extremely poor. I've raised all these issues in a lot of other countries, but that doesn't mean that rich countries get a free pass.
For the people you've met over the last couple of weeks, why does it need to change?
Well, I think they feel that the system is against them. I think they feel that it's punitive. I think they feel that the government doesn't care, that it's only interested in the broader economic bottom line.
And is there a sense that the government doesn't believe them?
Yes, I think the government people haven't been out into the field, haven't had to talk to them, haven't explored what the real circumstances are. So I've had a number of people say to me, but we're not aware of this, we don't think there is poverty in our country. To which I would simply say, open your eyes, get out and take a look.
What difference do you think Brexit might make to the people you've been meeting?
Well, if you exclude the sort of utopian scenario that everything's going to move very smoothly and there won't be any great difficulties, all of the economic assessments that have been made say, look, Brexit's going to come at a cost. Now, it's a cost that the British people are apparently prepared to pay. It's going to be those who are less well off who are going to bear the brunt of it.
Many of the poorer communities voted for
Yes,
Brexit.
because they were feeling insecure, neglected, ignored, but they're going to get a double whammy unless policies change.
The UN rapporteur for the Polston talking to Jackie Long there. Well, to pick up all of that, I'm joined now by the Treasury Minister, Mel Stride. We'll talk about Brexit in a moment, but let's begin with what we led on tonight, which was this very damning poverty report by the UN Special Rapporteur. He says poverty has been a political project of principle, that you could have spared the poorest people in Britain and spent billions on them. Instead, you chose to give it to the richest in tax cuts.
Well, good evening. And I think the image that Dr. Alston paints and portrays of our country and the extent of the difficulties and the challenges we face in the area of poverty is, I have to say, rather disproportionate. That said, there is very much at the heart of this government a very strong push to make sure that we reduce poverty.
Which bit is disproportionate?
We have, well,
when
for example,
1 in 5 people
is
are
not,
living in poverty.
Well, Christian, what is not being pointed out is that, for example, since 2010, we now have 1 million people fewer in absolute poverty, 300,000 fewer children in absolute poverty than before, and about 2/3 of 1 million fewer children in workless households. We have income inequality at a lower level today than it was in 2010.
I mean, you illustrate the problem really, really well in your answer, because what Mr. Alston has done has spent a long time going and talking to the poorest people about the problems in their lives, and they've told him about the terrible situations that they face, and he's thought about it and written it up. What you're doing is parroting a load of statistics that make you sound good.
No, these are real figures, and you're talking about poverty, and it's important.
Well, so is 1.5 million in destitution.
Well, Dr. Alston...
That's a real figure, isn't it?
Dr. Alston has spent 2 weeks on a fact-finding mission. He has written a 24-page report. I would imagine there are some statistics and figures in that, and if you're to have a meaningful discussion about something as important as poverty, and we believe it is, then I think the figures do actually matter.
Are there 1.5 million people who are destitute in Britain?
Major way...
Is that a real figure?
Well, what I can tell you is that we have record levels of employment.
Yeah,
we have the lowest level
Please don't ignore the question. Well, 1.5 million people in destitution. That's his figure. Is that a real figure or not? Destitution
is a figure that he has chosen to come forward with.
Is it true?
Well, if I can have a moment just to get a word out, what I do accept is that we have more to do, and we probably always will have more to do, to make sure that we look after and we get into work the poorest in our society. And what I was saying with the employment, I'm sorry to use numbers again, Christian, but your viewers probably would expect me to. We have more people in work now than at almost any time in our history. We have the lowest level of unemployment for about 45 years, and that's because we've managed the economy well, and that is something that through work we are helping to address poverty, which goes back to my earlier point about the progress we've made.
Again, the point he makes on work is that work itself does not take people out of poverty. In-work poverty is a massive problem. Right. 1 in 5 people in Britain right now are living in poverty. Many of them are in work.
So we have people in work, and in the recent budget, for example, we increased the personal allowance to take even more people out of tax altogether. So we have about 4 million of the lowest paid in our country paying no income tax at all. We've increased the national living wage, which was something that this government, this Conservative Party brought in. It went up by, sorry to use some numbers, but 4.4% last April, another 4.9% this April, well above the cost of living, the rise in the cost of living. We've been freezing fuel duty, and on universal credit, which I think was mentioned in your package, of course we made very important changes in the budget, increasing the work allowance by £1,000, which means that when UC is rolled out, 2.4 million people will be £630 a year, every year, better off. So those are things, real actions we're taking. But the point I really want to make here is we can only do that as a caring and responsible government if we're responsible with our finances. Yeah. And that's what this government has been.
And he points out you gave the richest people tax cuts instead of giving it to the poorest.
No, in the budget, and if you look since 2010 at the poorest 20%, for example, of earners in our country, they have disproportionately benefited from the combination of tax cuts and benefits. And I've mentioned the universal credit changes that we brought in at a huge cost. Another figure for you, I'm afraid, but £1.7 billion put in, because we're managing the economy well, into supporting the people that we most want to support. We want to support them into work, and we want to make work pay.
Well, away from Brexit, and the government came in for some pretty scathing criticism today, in particular for its universal credit programme. That in itself is hardly a first, but what is different is the fact that this time it comes from the United Nations. During a 12-day visit here, the UN's most senior investigator on global poverty said he saw a mean-spirited, callous approach which he said was plunging people into misery and despair.
Monkseaton is a suburb of Newcastle, a suburb like many others in cities across Britain. And like those places, it doesn't look the kind of place where people are struggling with poverty. But they are. Anna has worked hard all her life. A widow who worked in the care sector, she used to be a donor to the local food bank. Now she depends on it to be able to eat.
I feel terrible. I feel rock bottom. And there's nothing more I can say. And sometimes it's very hard to get up and get out of bed and just say, oh, well, actually, I've got a reason to get up and do something.
I'm a mother. I should be able to look after my family properly.
Philip Alston, an expert from the United Nations, visited Newcastle last week as part of his 12-day study on extreme poverty in the UK. The conclusions he's now drawn make uncomfortable reading. The strongly worded report said the British government had a punitive, mean-spirited and often callous approach to tackling poverty, with policies that have inflicted great misery unnecessarily on the working poor, single mothers, children and people with disabilities. It criticises universal credit, saying the rollout treats claimants like guinea pigs and can wreak havoc in people's lives.
It shouldn't be like this. Governments can do better. People shouldn't be treated that way. I think that's how I feel, that there's a a lot of people out there living in destitution in circumstances which is quite unnecessary.
The government says it rejects the findings, saying 1 million fewer are living in absolute poverty than 8 years ago. But 8 years ago, this food bank in Newcastle didn't exist. Those who work with people to help them out of poverty say government policies have created a perfect storm.
People who are living in poverty, 55% of those people are actually in work. So this is a problem that goes beyond people who are out of work or in ill health. It can be people who are working really, really hard day to day to provide for their family who end up coming to somewhere like the Bay Food Bank.
Anna says she's tried hard and contributed all her life, and now she's being punished.
You honestly feel like you're not part, you don't feel connected to society anymore.
Monk's Eaton is not so different from many other places. If there's poverty here, campaigners say, it can be almost anywhere. Damon Green, News at 10, Newcastle.